Let me pray, and then we're going to dive into our values. And I've got to give a warning for this talk because I don't know the last time you've been asked to speak about something that you're very passionate about, and you have like 20 minutes to do it. This is probably one of the things I'm most passionate about when it comes to our values in church. So give me some grace, y'all. Give me some grace. I've got a timer up here. I'm about to press start. It might be a little cerebral, maybe more than what we are used to. Usually we like to tell stories, but it felt right to give a rich foundation for why we do what we do. So let me pray, and then we'll jump into it. Jesus, thank you for who you've crafted our community to become. This exercise of trying to call out and discuss our why, values that have emerged from our story. We ask that you would be in the midst of us and be speaking into these things as we plan to hold them into the future as things that guide us. We trust you. We love you. We ask you to be around these tables with us, God, and teach us through each other. In Jesus' name, amen. I want to just start with a little bit of review of what we've been doing here. This is a definition from ACT psychology. I can share more about that if you're interested, but it's a definition of values that fits the why of why we're doing this pretty well. Values are deeply held beliefs or principles that guide our behavior and give our lives meaning and purpose. They are a compass that directs our action and helps us navigate challenges and opportunities that life presents. Part of this conversation is us as a community saying we've been traveling for about 6 years, and we had this desire, first of all, to articulate the values that have come out of that journey. So there's a couple values that we're working through, and we want to present them in this space for the sake of articulation, but also for the sake of discussion. So I invite you, as we move into our discussion, and we've been doing this from week to week, try to record some of the thoughts that come around your discussion, because these articulations of our aren't set in stone. We want them to be shaped by our community. So we're like 3 weeks into this. We first talked about how Jesus is our center. We're a church that's centered on Jesus. And that compels us into love. All of these values follow the Jesus leads us to formula, if you will. Jesus leads us to love. Last week, Isaac talked about a love of God, a deep love of God, a love of each other, and a love of the stranger, a love of our neighbors. I remember the moment where the light bulb went off for me on this next one. I had just completed reading the Gospel of Luke, and I was like, oh my goodness, Jesus eats a lot. I don't know if you've ever noticed reading about Jesus and reading the New Testament, the volume of times that Jesus finds himself at a meal, going to a meal, hosting a meal, inviting himself over to a meal. And that was the first time I remember going, what is the deal with that? Like, what are we supposed to do with that reality? One of the commentators that I've read put it this way. This is our value. Jesus leads us to the table. He put it this way. In Luke's gospel, Jesus is either going to a meal, at a meal, or coming from a meal. That's in Luke's gospel, but it's really a lot of the gospels. And the nerd in me came out a little bit this week, and I just wanted to visualize this light bulb that happened when I noticed that. And so here's a graph. These are all the spaces that Jesus finds himself in the midst of his ministry. All the stories that we have in the Gospels, these are the contexts that they're in. We have the synagogue and temple, the crowds, on the road, homes, mountains. I love that one. Outdoors, water, sea, garden, wilderness. And that's a red curtain to hide what meals and tables are, because I want to ask you how many you think it is in relation to the others. Any guesses? 25? More guesses? 40. I like that. More guesses? All right, I feel like we need a drum roll at this point. Can you provide a drum roll? 30. I just want to visually represent part of what the light bulb for me was. So this, again, reinforces the question, what is Jesus doing around meals? What is he trying to do with where he's situating his activity in his ministry? And how should that shape how we are led by Jesus? That's the primary question that leads us to this value. I just want to point out that beyond Jesus, the early church primarily spent their time in these two spaces, in homes and around tables, which then would represent 41 of these spaces. probably a majority. I'm not good at math, but approaching a majority. It's not to say, and I want to be clear, that they didn't engage in these other spaces. So please don't. I'm going to talk about table and its priority in Jesus's ministry, but please just refrain from thinking either or thinking. It's both and, but the prominence of Jesus around tables and meals should communicate something to us about how we should be led. And I just want to point out that for the last 500 plus years, most of the focuses of churches' gatherings and our orientation has been around these spaces, trying to gather a crowd in a temple or synagogue type gathering. That is not inherently bad. I'm just wondering, I'm asking a proportional question. Does the way that we operate as a community of Jesus reflect the way that Jesus operated in his ministry? That's the question. So it's not good or bad, wrong or right. I just want our lives as a church to reflect Jesus's life. What is Jesus doing around tables? I would sum it up in this way, as I've studied this a lot, as I've looked at what Jesus is trying to accomplish. Jesus is doing temple things in table spaces. Jesus is doing temple things in table spaces. I think in a subversive way, Jesus is disrupting the way of connecting with God, others, and neighbor by centering things that typically happen in the temple or people are longing for to happen in the temple, and he demonstrates them, he orchestrates them around tables with others. I just wanted to show you this. This is the array of stories in the New Testament beyond the Gospels where there's something happening around a table explicitly. This is just the multitude of stories that we have in the New Testament. And they break down into what I would say is like 8 movements from temple to table. So temple in that time is a place, a locale, a specific place where people would go to connect with God. And I think Jesus and his ministry is totally disrupting that reality through, first of all, his very presence being incarnate, but also in the spaces that he puts himself in and the spaces he leads his followers to recreate and be a part of. Let me fly through this real quickly. I told you cerebral, I told you buckle up, so here we go. The temple sermons, so communicating, he flipped that and did almost as much, if not more, communicating around dinner tables. Some prominent examples are at the Pharisees' tables when he's invited over for dinner and tells a story about a great banquet. And Levi, the tax collector, Jesus teaches that sinners can come and be a part of what he's doing. Another key part of the temple is sacrifices. A way to talk about that would be worship, like offering things that are valuable to us to show appreciation to God, to experience some sort of transformation from God. And he takes that and centers it at the table where we receive grace and forgiveness. And he gets a ton of flack for forgiving people outside of the temple, for giving grace outside of a ritual, outside of a temple, outside of a space. The prominent example of that, and I want to return to this story in a little bit, is the road to Emmaus. That story has stuck with me for so long, where he journeys with 2 disciples, and then he reveals who he is as a resurrected Jesus around a table. It just begs the question, why does the resurrected Jesus, in all that he could be doing in the 40 days that he's interacting with his followers, why does he show up on a long journey with a long conversation and that ends around a table to reveal himself to people who are walking away from faith? Why would he do that if table doesn't matter? Why would he do that if it isn't a really important space for him? Couple more ways this transition happens for Jesus. Healing and prayer no longer are centered on what can happen in the temple, but they're around tables. Prominent examples of this is the Pharisees' house. Jesus heals a man with dropsy. Peter's home, he heals his mother-in-law. The temple is this iconic place for God's very presence. His Shekinah glory is the Hebrew reference to that. And after the veil is torn, after Jesus is resurrected, in a very dynamic way, we have story after story of spirit-filled church around the table, not in the temple, around the table. He repositions where people go to experience the presence of God. At the altar, so we have now a new practice of sacrifice, a new practice of engaging with God in communion together. And he retransforms the temple priesthood, radical servanthood enacted through dinner, communication, commissioning, and priesthood of all. And the iconic text for that is where he kneels down, gets in the posture of a service, and he wipes his disciples' feet. He washes his disciples' feet, and he says, "Go and do likewise." And here's what this shift culminates in. No longer are there priests or pastors like me that need certifications and degrees to be the dispensers of all that the temple offers. Our job now, those of us who are professional Christians, is to equip the people to do the work of the ministry. The New Testament is clear and explicit that now it's not centered on having a robe. It's centered on having a calling and an infilling of the Holy Spirit and being sent on mission with Jesus as a way that God is connecting and building relationships with people. And ultimately, at the end, when we look towards the final, all things, what we're going towards, it's not a new temple with new rituals per se. It is a banquet. It is a feast. It is presence around a table with others whom God has created and in his presence. How we doing? We good? I'm giving you all this to provoke thoughts and discussion around your table. What does this mean for us? What does this shift from temple to table mean? I think in one phrase, it means transformational belonging. There's this moment where he's turning tables in the temple, and there's a lot going on there. But one of the things that's super clear is that the system that has been built in that time is become a barrier, not a help, to creating transformational belonging for the people who are seeking it. And then children and widows flood the space. They start singing Hosanna. Those who are outcast and estranged come to the center. And Jesus transforms what it means to pursue transformational belonging, and he centers it around what you're experiencing right now, or forms of it. So what does this mean for us? Part of this process has been articulating some of the values, this value and what it means for us. So I'm just going to read this for you, and then I have some sheets of paper I can pass out during discussion for you to reference back. This isn't a constitution. Me and Thomas Jefferson didn't write this in a quill and it's down, This is just a expression of articulation, and not even to the level of detail where we have to follow it letter of the law. It is just an expression of what this could mean for us. We are certain that we are a community that's drawn to be a table church. But what that looks like will express itself in different ways. And here's what it could mean. North City is a table church. We are centered on the ancient practice of gathering around table in the presence of Jesus, our sincere selves, the beloved community, and the stranger. These intentional table spaces are not just human customs, but can be sacred spaces where God works. Jesus welcomed strangers, healed the sick, forgave sins, worshiped, proclaimed the good news of the kingdom around meals. The early church followed his lead, breaking bread in homes and community spaces, seeking God's presence as they nourished both body and soul. At Brunch Church, Dinner Church, Microchurch, and discipleship spaces, we gather around table, anticipating and participating in Jesus's work. This also naturally leads us to this idea of the priesthood of all believers. Like, bro, I don't really like collars, so please don't call me to be a priest. That's not what's being said here. This is a rich theological understanding of the implication of recentering the activity of what Jesus is doing around everyday spaces like a table. It empowers you as a follower of Jesus with a priestly calling. And what that means is that you get to be a part of the work of bringing those different elements that we looked at to everyday spaces into people who are seeking after God. And this is our articulation of that. At these tables and in everyday life, we affirm that every disciple has a priestly calling, called to be an attentive agent of God's work and presence. What Jesus once did at the table, he now shares with his people, blessing bread, extending forgiveness, offering healing presence, proclaiming good news. Pastors, staff, leadership team members, microchurch leaders are servants who equip others for this priestly work. North City is a mission partner-led, staff-supported church. We strive to live as co-creators with Jesus by the Spirit and with one another. We are not passive consumers, but active participants in Jesus's work in our lives and at the table. And ultimately what this means, and I love the outcome of this movement by Jesus, is the love of stranger. That Greek word is the word for hospitality, philioxena, which is basically the opposite of xenophobia. It means friend and love. It's the love of stranger. And this is how we'd articulate the difference that makes. God is a self-giving love made flesh in Jesus. Let me read that again. God is self-giving love made flesh in Jesus. He embodied this love in his sacrifice, resurrection, and everyday hospitality, making space for strangers at his table until they became neighbors and a part of God's family. Where the temple once kept outsiders at a distance, Jesus drew them close around meals. To follow him is to make space in our hearts, homes, and tables for those who feel foreign and isolated. North City exists not for itself, but also for its neighbors, especially those cut off from belonging. In an age of epidemic isolation and loneliness, Jesus is leading us to be a community of welcome, belonging, and home. Our table is a place of welcome. This is my dining room table here. It never looks like that. For some reason, it looked like that this morning, and I was like, seize the opportunity. I should have taken a more realistic picture. We got this table on Facebook Marketplace used a long time ago. It's got bumps and bruises. If you've been to my house, you've seen the dried paint we can't get off, the smudges. Our life happens around this table. I'm sure my tears are somewhere in the woodwork. Our laughter echoes off that oak or whatever it is. And everyone's home's not like ours. Everyone's home's not centered on the table, but there are spaces of table in your everyday life. And let's not miss the forest for the trees with this one. I think Jesus came and recentered God's work from the temple to the table to his incarnational presence that we carry with us around the table because he wanted to be a part of everyday life. He wanted to be in the tears. He wanted to be in the screams when I can't figure out the math problem. He wanted to be in the midst of the hard news that's shared at your table. He wanted to be in your real life. He wanted to be near you. And so when we reflect that as a table church, when we set up the way we gather together, when we create time for discussion and eating together, that is just a mirror of what we believe about who Jesus is. And when we go out in our community and build relationships around table, that's our desire, to echo who Jesus is. Now, this does not negate all the other things the church is doing. We're not the best church in town because we do this. That's not what I'm saying. This conversation is about our calling, what Jesus is asking us to do. And I think now more than ever, we need churches. We, in this neighborhood, need to create more spaces like this. The last thing I'll say about this is I looked into the first few centuries of the church where this was the prominent way they gathered. It started to echo and ring true to some of the same struggles we have today in our relationships and society. It was an underground movement because if you said the wrong things in the wrong places, you would either experience a social death or there would be violence against your family. There was intense polarization. There was racism. There were all the things in different forms that we experience today. There was socioeconomic spreading. The rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer. And in the midst of that story came tables, came these unremarkable/remarkable little gatherings in people's homes, where the rich and well-connected sat next to the people who cleaned the gutters, where all of those things that polarize society kind of melted away. And all because of a God who came in flesh and did most of his ministry around those very tables. And it strikes me that one of the best ways we can participate in the things that are off, in the tension that we experience in our life today, both in a big sense and a personal sense, is to keep investing in these spaces. I want to talk about this now. I'm just following Jesus' example. Enough synagogue preaching. Now it's time for table discussion. Okay. I would love to hear what you think about this. I want you to find 2 to 3 people. I know that's a big table there. I'd encourage you guys to kind of break off 2 to 3 people. And here are some questions that I would love for you to discuss. If you're willing to capture some of those things, there'll be a way to send that in to help us shape and clearly articulate this value into the future. But I want you to ask, hey, what difference could this make in our lives? And maybe just how is it resonating now? How do you see this ringing true in your own life? What's standing out to you? What questions does this raise? And what might God be saying now and into the future for us, for you? So maybe zero in on one of these questions that really spark ideas right away for you. And then with the two or three people, we'll have some time to share that with each other. Okay, let's go there. Hey, one of the things we love to do every once in a while is just kind of glean some of the conversation from around the room. So I would just for the next 2 minutes, is there something someone said or something you offered at your table that you would want to offer with the whole group? What stood out to you? What questions came up? Anything? JJ.
In my opinion, God's trying to teach us in the beginning, when you were saying centuries before, they always ate outside, they always gathered. Church isn't a building, it's where the people are at. You gather, even when companies have their company picnics or they have their Christmas parties, it's the co-work guys who are in the warehouse, some are considered peons, even the janitors, they may be peons at work, but yet, like you had alluded to, when they come to a gathering like this, they don't have to be intimidated by the higher ups. They don't have to be intimidated by the supervisors. They can talk to them. They can, they can fellowship. They can learn something new. The supervisors themselves learn something new. Even here, we're from different talks of life, different religions probably at times, but yet we all learn from each other. And that's what God's trying to teach us. And then in the end, when we go to heaven, there's a feast. Where's that? A table.
Preach. Love it. Thank you. Anyone else want to share something? Dan.
I thought Katie made a great point about how the temple-centric sort of structure was there before Jesus was there, and seemingly we returned to that after Jesus left. And we talked a little bit about well, why did it return to that after Jesus left? And my thoughts had to do a lot went around the idea of sometimes it's around people trying to consolidate power. Sometimes it's just people just returning to what they know and what's comfortable. But usually corralling a people around a single person is a lot easier to um, have like the border structure that we talked about a couple weeks ago.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, it's a good question. How do we return to that? All right, Jordan. 30 seconds here, and Kara's going to lead us in the
I'll
song.
start singing over you like the Emmys.
We won't take donations away from children, though.
Just a theme that came up as all the four of us were talking was just how Jesus would purposely put people together at a table, and it was always uncomfortable. And how there's something about if we can easily be around a table and just make our own groups and a safe space. Not that all spaces shouldn't be safe, but there's something about a table with Jesus that is uncomfortable. And that needs to be an aspect of it.
Don't love that, but it's very true. Yeah. I hope that you saw just there how discussion enriches our time and enriches even what Jesus is telling us. Let me pray, and Kara's going to lead us in worship together. Jesus, thank you how you forged this community to just be situated differently, to reach people who aren't being reached now, to be formed in ways that maybe we wouldn't be formed in elsewhere or in other forms. Jesus, we ultimately worship you, whether we're in a building worship gathering outside or around tables. You're the host of these tables. It's your presence that we seek. Would you be with us now, even continuing to teach us and speak to us and leading and guiding us as we worship?